Without World War II, the 20th century would have unfolded in ways that are almost unimaginable. To understand the ramifications, we need to examine the political, social, economic, and technological impacts that the war had, and then consider what might have happened if it had never occurred. At the political level, the absence of a global conflict of this magnitude would have significantly altered the balance of power in Europe and Asia. Germany, for instance, would have remained under the Weimar Republic's legacy or perhaps under Hitler's early dictatorship. But the cataclysmic war that eventually crushed the Nazi regime would never have taken place. This could mean that authoritarian regimes might have persisted for much longer without the worldwide opposition that World War II mobilized. In such a scenario, Europe might have faced a slow and steady rise of nationalism rather than a sudden, violent confrontation. Countries like Britain, France, and the United States would have approached global politics with different priorities. The League of Nations, which failed in our timeline, might have gained credibility in resolving international disputes, or conversely, may have continued to falter, allowing small regional conflicts to fester. Economically, the world would look drastically different. The Great Depression of the 1930s had already left nations reeling, but WWII's industrial mobilization essentially ended the Depression in the United States and revitalized economies across Europe. Without the war, unemployment would have remained high for longer, and technological innovation driven by military necessity would have slowed. Factories producing tanks, aircraft, and munitions were repurposed after the war for consumer goods, driving post-war economic booms. Without this transition, the global economy might have stagnated, leaving millions in poverty and delaying the rise of a robust middle class. Japan, too, would have continued its imperial ambitions in Asia, but without the catastrophic defeat that forced it to modernize under American occupation. The ripple effects on trade, industry, and global markets would have been profound, creating a world with far less economic interconnectedness and possibly a slower pace of modernization. The social consequences would be equally dramatic. World War II caused unprecedented displacement of populations, yet also accelerated social change. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, minorities gained new opportunities, and the horrors of the Holocaust ultimately fueled movements for civil rights and human rights globally. Without the war, these social shifts might have occurred far more slowly. Women could have remained in traditional domestic roles for decades longer. Racial inequalities in countries like the United States might have persisted with less pressure for reform, and colonial subjects in Asia and Africa might have waited much longer to see the independence movements that World War II indirectly inspired. The psychological scars of the war, while horrific, also created a global consensus on the need to prevent such a catastrophe in the future. In a world without World War II, the lessons of extreme nationalism, genocide, and unchecked militarism might have been learned too late or not at all, leaving the planet vulnerable to other forms of large-scale conflict. Technologically, the absence of World War II would have slowed some of the most critical advances of the 20th century. Radar, jet engines, nuclear energy, and early computers were all developed or perfected under the pressure of wartime needs. The Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb, would likely have never existed, delaying the nuclear age by decades. Medical advancements, too, including antibiotics mass production, blood transfusion techniques, and surgical innovations, were accelerated by the necessity of treating war injuries. In a peacetime world, these technologies might have emerged more slowly, changing the trajectory of medicine, energy, and communication. Aviation would have evolved at a less intense pace, meaning that commercial air travel may have remained a novelty for longer, and space exploration might have been delayed. The post-war technological boom that led to the modern digital age was in many ways a direct product of the war's demands, meaning that without World War II, the world today might look far less advanced. Geopolitically, the absence of World War II would have prevented the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers, at least in the same way. The war elevated the U.S. from a relatively isolationist nation to a global leader with unmatched military and economic power. Similarly, the Soviet Union, despite staggering losses, emerged as a dominant force in Eastern Europe, spreading its influence far beyond its borders. Without the war, the balance of power would have remained more fragmented, and Europe might have experienced ongoing regional conflicts rather than a single climactic confrontation. The Cold War might never have occurred, or it could have taken an entirely different form, perhaps as a slow struggle for influence between older empires rather than a battle between two superpowers. Nations like China, India, and the Middle East could have followed different developmental trajectories, with colonial powers maintaining more control for a longer period. The map of the modern world, therefore, could have looked strikingly different. Culturally, the war's absence would have prevented certain global movements in literature, art, and film that were directly influenced by the conflict. Think of the existentialist works of European authors reacting to the horrors of occupation and genocide, or American films capturing the war experience and its emotional weight. Music, too, including jazz's international spread, the rise of swing, and later rock and roll, were all shaped indirectly by the wartime experience and the social transformations it triggered. Without the war, cultural evolution may have been slower, more localized, and less infused with the urgency of global events. The sense of a shared human experience forged in the crucible of conflict, the "we survived together" narrative, might have been replaced with a fragmented cultural landscape. The moral and ethical implications would also be profound. The Holocaust, one of history's darkest chapters, might have been avoided entirely if World War II had not occurred. Millions of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and others would have survived. Yet, the systemic anti-Semitism and oppressive policies of the Nazis might have continued unchecked in Germany and occupied territories, creating a more insidious, slower-burning injustice. Other atrocities, like the forced labor and human experimentation that occurred during the war, might have been postponed but not necessarily avoided, as totalitarian regimes were still on the rise. The world's collective confrontation with evil, the Nuremberg trials, and the establishment of international human rights law might have taken decades longer to emerge. In a sense, the absence of World War II could have created a moral vacuum in which atrocities occurred on a smaller, less visible scale, but without the global awareness that the war brought. Finally, the psychological dimension of human ambition and conflict must be considered. Humans have always sought power, and scarcity and inequality often lead to war. Even if World War II had been avoided, other large-scale conflicts would likely have emerged. Perhaps a smaller, regional conflict would have escalated, or competition over colonies, natural resources, and ideologies might have led to a delayed but equally destructive confrontation. Peaceful coexistence on a global scale would have required a level of cooperation and restraint that history shows is extremely rare. In this sense, World War II, horrific as it was, reshaped the world in ways that eventually promoted a fragile global order, technological advancement, and social progress. Its absence would have created a world with less destruction in the short term, but possibly far more uncertainty and delayed progress in the long term. In conclusion, imagining a world without World War II forces us to confront the intricate web of cause and effect that defines history. Politically, authoritarian regimes might have persisted longer, and the United States and Soviet Union might never have risen as superpowers. Economically, the world might have endured prolonged depression and slower modernization. Socially, progress in civil rights, women's empowerment, and decolonization could have been delayed by decades. Technologically, innovation would have proceeded at a far slower pace, affecting medicine, energy, aviation, and computing. Geopolitically, the map of the modern world would be unrecognizable, with colonial powers holding sway longer and regional conflicts taking different forms. Culturally and morally, humanity might have avoided some atrocities, like the Holocaust, but could have remained blind to others, delaying the emergence of global ethical standards. Ultimately, the absence of World War II presents a paradox, a world temporarily spared immense suffering, yet one in which progress, awareness, and global cooperation may have lagged dangerously behind. History teaches us that conflict, while devastating, often accelerates change, reshapes societies, and forces humanity to confront both its worst and its best impulses. A world without World War II might have been safer in some ways, but it may also have been a slower, darker, and far less interconnected place than the one we know today.